Warning lights don't usually scare me. After 15 years flying F-18s, you get used to the occasional hiccup. But that day over the Pacific, 350 miles from the nearest landing strip, the sudden flash of red was different. I just completed a classified reconnaissance mission near disputed airspace when the first engine temperature gauge shot into the red zone. Sierra 7 to 7, this is command. Status report. The voice in my headset sounded routine, but I knew better. They'd seen my telemetry data. My hands instinctively tightened around the stick as I felt the first shudder ripple through the $70 million aircraft. Command, Sierra 7 to 7. I'm showing engine 1 over temp, possible compressor stall. I kept my voice level the way they teach you at flight school. Never let them hear you sweat. The turbulence hit without warning. Not atmospheric, this was internal. The entire airframe vibrated as warning tones multiplied through my helmet. Sierra 7 to 7. We're seeing cascading failures in your propulsion systems. The controller's voice had lost its casual edge. I glanced at my altitude, 31,500 feet. Plenty of time to troubleshoot. That's what I told myself. But then the smell hit me, that unmistakable electrical burn that every pilot dreads. I ran through the emergency checklist that was burned into my memory after thousands of simulator hours. Power cycling, system reboots, auxiliary power unit engagement. Nothing was responding. The vibrations intensified, and that's when I caught sight of it in my peripheral vision. Flames licking the edge of my starboard wing. What they don't tell you in training is how time seems to slow down when disaster strikes. Every second stretched into what felt like minutes as I processed the reality of my situation. Command, Sierra 7 to 7. I've got visible fire on engine 2, attempting shutdown and containment procedures. My voice remained steady, but my pulse was racing. The digital display showed my primary engine already offline, and now my secondary was literally burning up. At 30,000 feet, a fighter becomes nothing more than an extremely expensive glider, and not a particularly good one. I thought about Sarah and the kids back home, how I'd promised to take them fishing this weekend. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd survived 3 combat tours only to face my mortality on what should have been a routine mission. The aircraft lurched violently to the right as the second engine failed catastrophically. Warning klaxons blared through my helmet as multiple systems went dark simultaneously. Sierra 7 to 7. We're tracking rapid altitude loss. Your descent rate is exceeding parameters. Command's voice had that clinical tone they use when they're watching someone potentially die in real time. I can almost picture them in the control room, already calculating recovery coordinates. Roger that, Command. Both engines are non-responsive. I'm going to attempt to establish a control glide and assess my options. What I didn't say was how limited those options were. With no engines, no nearby airfields, and the vast Pacific stretching beneath me, I was facing the kind of scenario that usually only exists in training simulations, except this was horrifyingly real. I've always told rookie pilots that emergency procedures need to become second nature, muscle memory that kicks in when your conscious mind is still processing the shock. As I watched both engine failure indicators glaring red on my display panel, those countless drills finally paid off. Sierra 7 to 7. Activate emergency power systems and prepare for controlled descent. Command instructed, their voice steady but urgent. My hands moved almost automatically, flipping the auxiliary power switches and adjusting my control surfaces for optimal glide ratio. The aircraft was dropping altitude quickly, too quickly, as I fought to maintain a stable flight path without thrust. Every pilot knows the glide ratio of their aircraft by heart. For my F-18, that meant I could travel roughly 1.5 miles forward for every 1,000 feet of altitude lost. The fire warning continued to flash as the onboard suppression systems fought to contain the blaze in my starboard engine. Through my cockpit window, I could see black smoke trailing behind me like a dark signature against the clear blue sky. Command, fire suppression is engaged, but may not be fully effective. I need landing options within 100 nautical miles of my position. The sweat was beginning to soak through my flight suit, not from the heat of the fire, but from the adrenaline surging through my system. My eyes darted between the rapidly descending altimeter and a navigation display, calculating possible landing zones. The ocean below looked deceptively calm from this height, a beautiful but deadly landing option that I'd avoid at all costs. Ejection was always the last resort. You don't abandon a $70 million aircraft unless there's absolutely no alternative. Sierra 7 We're analyzing possible landing sites. Nearest viable airstrip is Wake Island, bearing 095, distance 87 nautical miles. The information from command gave me the first glimmer of hope since the crisis began. I quickly did the mental math. Starting from just under 30,000 feet, my glide ratio might just get me within range, but it would be cutting it dangerously close. Copy that command. Plotting course to Wake Island. I banked the aircraft gently, feeling how sluggish the controls had become without engine power. The HUD displayed my optimal glide speed, 220 knots, which I struggled to maintain as the aircraft wanted to either stall or dive. Every pilot trains for the so-called dead stick landing, but actually performing one from cruise altitude over open ocean was another matter entirely. The smoke in my cockpit was getting thicker despite the emergency ventilation systems. Each breath became more labored as I pulled my oxygen mask tighter against my face. Sierra 7 Your descent rate is still outside optimal parameters. Adjust pitch angle to maintain best glide speed. The controller's voice betrayed a hint of concern that wasn't there before. I knew what they weren't saying. My trajectory wasn't looking good for reaching Wake Island. The fire had damaged more than just my engines. My hydraulic pressure was dropping, making the control surfaces increasingly difficult to manipulate. As I passed through 25,000 feet, I realized I was fighting not just gravity and aerodynamics, but also the progressive failure of the aircraft's core systems. And all the while, that merciless countdown continued. Altitude dropping, distance to safety still dauntingly large, and options diminishing with every passing second. At 20,000 feet, I faced the first of several life-or-death decisions that would define the next few minutes. The fire warning for Engine 2 had finally silenced, but the damage was extensive. My hydraulic pressure continued to decrease, and flight control responsiveness was deteriorating by the second. Sierra 7 We're getting telemetry indicating potential control surface failure. What's your status? Command's question carried the weight of unspoken implications. They were asking, in their professional way, if it was time to punch out. Still maintaining controlled flight, I responded, fighting the stick that had become increasingly resistant. But I'm losing hydraulic pressure on the primary and secondary systems. What I didn't add was that ejection over open water, 60 miles from the nearest land, carried its own deadly statistics. The decision matrix we're taught in flight school flashed through my mind. Assess aircraft controllability, evaluate landing options, consider survival probability for each scenario. With Wake Island still a distant possibility, and my aircraft becoming less responsive, I needed to decide quickly whether to continue the attempt or eject while I still had control. Sierra 7 We've dispatched rescue assets to your position and alerted Wake Island personnel to prepare for an emergency landing. Command was giving me options, but the final call would be mine alone. I scanned my instruments again. 18,500 feet now, airspeed stable at 210 knots, slightly below optimal glide, but still manageable. The navigation computer estimated I'd reach Wake Island's approach path with just 1,200 feet of altitude remaining, essentially zero margin for error. Command, I'm continuing to Wake. Please advise on runway conditions and have crash response standing by. I made my decision. If I could maintain this glide path, a landing was possible, difficult and dangerous, but possible. The alternative was ejection over open ocean, miles from shore with water temperatures that would give me hours at most before hypothermia set in. The display showed 16,000 feet as I made minute adjustments to my flight path, tried to extract every possible foot of horizontal distance from my descent. Sierra 7 Wake Island confirms runway 27 is clear. Winds 250 at 15 knots. They've deployed all emergency response teams. The runway information was another piece of the complex puzzle. A headwind component would reduce my ground speed on approach, potentially helping with a landing, but reducing my glide range. As I passed through 15,000 feet, another system failure alert illuminated. My backup electrical system was showing signs of instability. If it failed completely, I'd lose navigation systems, communications, and any remaining electronic control assistance. Command, be advised I'm experiencing electrical system fluctuations. May lose comms shortly. I try to keep the gravity of the situation out of my voice. Without consistent electrical power, the aircraft would become even more difficult to control, and finding Wake Island would rely on visual navigation alone. I quickly memorized the heading and distance information while I still had it displayed. The situation was deteriorating faster than anticipated, forcing me to consider yet another critical decision. Would continuing toward Wake Island remain viable if I lost all electronic systems? Or would the open ocean beneath me become my only option after all? The altimeter continued its relentless countdown, each lost foot of altitude narrowing my choices and pushing me closer to a point of no return. Breaking through 12,000 feet, I caught my first glimpse of Wake Island, a tiny crescent of land barely visible on the horizon. That distant strip of green and tan amid endless blue should have been reassuring, but the navigation computer's estimate was becoming more dire. Arrival altitude, now projected at 800 feet, barely enough for a single approach attempt. Sierra 7-7. Wake Island has visual contact. They confirm your approach vector is good, but recommend slight heading adjustment to 098 to compensate for crosswind drift. I acknowledged command's instruction while fighting with increasingly unresponsive controls. The electrical fluctuations had progressed to intermittent failures, causing my display to flicker and occasionally go dark for heart-stopping seconds at a time. The standard approach procedure for Wake's runway was completely irrelevant now. I wouldn't have the luxury of multiple approach legs or gradual descent. Instead, I needed to position myself for what pilots grimly call a straight-in dead stick, a single continuous glide path that would either end in a successful landing or the alternative. Sierra 7-7. We're losing telemetry data from your aircraft. Please confirm status verbally. Command's message confirmed what my flickering instruments already told me. The aircraft systems were failing faster than anticipated. Still maintaining controlled flight, I reported, though controlled was becoming a generous description. Electrical system critically degraded. 9,000 feet, airspeed 200 knots, approximately 35 miles from runway threshold. The ocean beneath me gradually transformed from an abstract blue expanse to discernible white caps and swells, a visual reminder of my steadily decreasing altitude. At 7,000 feet, I committed to final approach configuration, lowering my landing gear using the emergency manual release. The drag increased immediately, steepening my descent angle, but giving me the configuration I'd need for landing. It was another calculated risk. If I'd misjudged my glide path, the extra drag could cause me to fall short of the runway. Gear down and locked. I reported, the strain evident in my voice as I pulled against the increasingly heavy control stick. 6,000 feet, 28 miles out. The math was becoming alarmingly clear. I was going to arrive with minimal altitude to spare, if at all. Sierra 7-7. Wake Island emergency crews are in position. Be advised local hospital has been notified and medical evacuation options are being prepared. Command's message carried the unspoken acknowledgement that this landing, if I made it to the runway at all, would likely not be gentle. I forced myself to focus on the immediate tasks, maintaining optimal glide speed, adjusting for the crosswind that was pushing me south of my intended track, and preserving what little hydraulic pressure remained for the final approach and landing. The island was growing larger now, its runway visible as a thin gray line against the tropical landscape. At 5,000 feet and 20 miles out, my calculations showed I might actually make it, but only if everything went perfectly from this point forward. And in my 15 years of flying, I'd learned that when systems start failing, they rarely do so in isolation. The question wasn't if something else would go wrong, but what and when, and whether I could adapt quickly enough when it did. By 4,000 feet, the battle with the aircraft had become intensely physical. With hydraulic pressure nearly depleted, moving the control surfaces required brute force rather than the usual light touch. Each adjustment of the stick sent pain shooting through my shoulders and arms. Sierra 7-7, Wake Island Tower reports visual contact. Your altitude appears lower than optimal approach path. The controller's measured tone couldn't disguise the concern behind their words. They were watching what increasingly looked like a doomed approach. Copy that. I managed between labored breaths. Working the problem. Working the problem. The understated pilot speak for fighting with everything you have to prevent disaster. The electrical system failure had progressed to the point where my primary instruments were now completely dark. The backup analog gauges, technology dating back decades, had become my lifeline. Airspeed, altitude, attitude indicator. The basic trinity of flight instruments that every pilot learns to rely on when everything else fails. Wake Island was now clearly visible, but so was the alarming truth about my approach angle. I was going to be short. Sierra 7-7. Recommend immediate course correction to intercept extended runway centerline. The controller was trying to help, but they didn't understand my situation. Any significant course change would cost precious energy that I couldn't afford to lose. Instead, I focused on extracting every possible foot of distance from my remaining altitude. At 3,000 feet, another failure, this time catastrophic. The aircraft shuddered violently as something structural gave way in the right wing. The stick suddenly pulled hard right, nearly tearing from my grip as the aircraft tried to roll into an unrecoverable spiral. Mayday, mayday. Sierra 7-7 experiencing severe control issues. I fought the stick with both hands, using all my strength to counter the roll. The pain in my shoulders became searing, but adrenaline pushed me through it. Through gritted teeth, I managed to level the wings, but the aircraft was now descending even more rapidly. The altimeter unwound past 2,500 feet as Wake Island seemed to hover stubbornly at the edge of reachable distance. I realized I was witnessing the final moments of my military career. One way or another, this flight would be my last. Sierra 7-7. Rescue helicopters are airborne and tracking your position. Command's update confirmed what I already suspected. They were preparing for the likelihood I wouldn't reach the runway. The message was followed by an uncomfortable silence, the kind that occurs when there's nothing useful left to say. At 2,000 feet, I made my final decision. I would attempt to reach the shallow water near the island's edge rather than risk falling short into the deeper ocean. Command, adjusting approach for water landing near shoreline, approximately 1 mile short of runway threshold. My voice was strained but determined. The irony wasn't lost on me. After fighting so hard to reach the runway, I was now deliberately aiming short. But a water landing near shore, while extremely dangerous, offered better survival chances than either an ocean ditching or an attempted runway landing that I'd likely fall short of anyway. As I descended through 1,500 feet, just 8 miles from the island, I began the mental shift from trying to save the aircraft to focusing entirely on surviving the next few minutes. At 1,000 feet, time compressed into a series of critical moments. The island filled my forward view, tantalizingly close, yet still beyond optimal glide range. Sierra 7-7. Your current trajectory will place you approximately 0.8 miles short of the shoreline, the controller reported, their voice tight with professional concern. I didn't respond immediately. Every ounce of my concentration focused on maintaining what little control remained. The stick was now almost completely unresponsive in the roll axis, forcing me to use rudder inputs, themselves barely effective to maintain directional control. Sweat stung my eyes as the physical exertion of fighting the controls combined with the cockpit's increasing temperature. The emergency procedures manual doesn't tell you how much it hurts to fly a dying aircraft. Sierra 7 to 7. Recommend ejection while still within controlled flight parameters. Command was making the call I'd been wrestling with internally. Standard procedure dictated ejection before losing complete control, but ejecting over water carried its own significant risks. Negative on ejection, I responded, my voice hoarse, still maintaining sufficient control for water landing. What I didn't say was that I wasn't ready to abandon my aircraft, not while any chance remained of bringing it down intact. At 800 feet, I caught sight of something that changed my calculations entirely. A sandbar extending from the island's northwest edge, creating a natural runway of sorts below the water surface. If I could reach it, the shallow depth might prevent the aircraft from sinking immediately after impact. The altimeter passed through 600 feet as I aligned with this natural underwater extension of the island. Command, adjusting approach to target sandbar north of the main island. Request rescue assets reposition accordingly. My words came between labored breaths as I wrestled the aircraft into position. Each adjustment required enormous physical effort, the control stick feeling like it was set in concrete rather than designed for human operation. The airspeed indicator showed 170 knots, faster than ideal for water impact, but I had no means to slow further without sacrificing precious glide distance. At 500 feet, I began final landing preparations, tightening my harness to the point of discomfort, securing loose items in the cockpit, and mentally rehearsing the post-impact egress sequence. Sierra 7 to 7. We have multiple eyes on you. Rescue assets are repositioning to your new approach path. The controller's voice had taken on a quality I'd never heard before, a mixture of professional detachment and human concern. At 400 feet, the reality of what was about to happen crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. I was going to crash. The only questions remaining were exactly where, how hard, and whether I'd survive the impact. Command, if this doesn't go as planned, there's a letter in my quarters addressed to my family. I paused, swallowing hard. Make sure they get it. The silence that followed conveyed more than words could have. As I descended through 300 feet, less than a mile from the sandbar, I began the final checklist, one not found in any flight manual but known to every pilot who's faced the ultimate test. Check harness, brace position, deep breath, and the most important item of all, the absolute, unwavering determination to survive what comes next. At 200 feet, the water surface revealed details invisible from higher altitude. Small waves, patches of varying color indicating depth changes, and the sandbar's outline beneath the turquoise shallows. Sierra 7 to 7. Wind at surface level reported as 270 at 18 knots, gusting to 25. The controller's information was crucial, a stronger crosswind than anticipated, which would further complicate my already precarious approach. I adjusted as best I could with the limited control response, angling the aircraft slightly into the wind to counter drift. My hands ached from the death grip on the controls, but releasing pressure for even a moment would allow the aircraft to deviate from the narrow path that might mean the difference between survival and disaster. The aircraft passed through 150 feet, and I began the final landing sequence. Airspeed 155 knots, descent rate approximately 800 feet per minute. I reported mechanically, as much to focus my own mind as to inform command. In a normal landing, this descent rate would be concerning but manageable. For a water impact, it was dangerously high. I pulled back slightly on the stick, fighting both the aircraft's natural tendency to pitch down and my own instinct to flare too early. Too much altitude lost too quickly would mean a harder impact. Too little descent rate would mean falling short of the sandbar and ditching in deeper water. At 100 feet, details of the water's surface became alarmingly clear. I could see the sandbar's edges, patches of coral, and the varying blues and greens indicating depth changes. 50 feet, I called out, no longer certain if my radio was even transmitting. The aircraft shuddered as it encountered ground effect, the cushion of compressed air that forms between wings and surface during low-level flight. Under normal circumstances, this aerodynamic phenomenon helps with landing, Now, it provided a momentary illusion of stability in an otherwise uncontrollable descent. 30 feet, 20. I continued the call-out, as I had thousands of times before in simulators and training flights. Only this time, instead of runway concrete approaching beneath me, it was the deceptively serene surface of the Pacific. At 10 feet, I made my final control input, a slight back pressure on the stick to arrest the descent rate and level the aircraft's attitude for impact. The first contact with water came not as a single dramatic impact, but as a series of violent interactions. The aircraft's belly skipping across the surface like a stone across a pond, each contact sending shockwaves through the airframe and my body. The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony of water impact, tearing metal, and multiple system failures occurring simultaneously. The canopy instantly covered with spray, eliminating all visibility. Deceleration forces pressed me hard against my harness as the aircraft rapidly shed speed, transforming from flying machine to uncontrolled projectile to maritime wreckage in the space of seconds. The final impact came as the aircraft's nose dug into the sandbar, bringing the forward momentum to an abrupt, violent halt. My head snapped forward despite the harness, then back against the headrest with enough force to momentarily dim my vision. As the aircraft settled, tilting slightly to the right, an eerie silence replaced the chaos of impact, broken only by the sound of water rushing into the damaged airframe and the distant, muffled whop-whop-whop of rescue helicopters already inbound to my position. The immediate aftermath of the crash unfolded in a disorienting blur of sensations. Cold water rushed into the cockpit through multiple breach points, quickly rising past my knees. The acrid smell of electrical fires and hydraulic fluid filled what breathable air remained. My training took over before conscious thought could form. Oxygen mask off, harness release located, canopy emergency jettison handle identified. Sierra 7 to 7 is down. I managed to transmit, unsure if my communication still functioned. Aircraft intact, but taking on water rapidly. The words came automatically while my hands moved through the emergency egress sequence I'd practiced countless times, but never expected to perform for real. The survival clock was ticking. Aircraft that ditch in water typically remain buoyant for minutes, not hours. The canopy release mechanism functioned despite the damage, blowing upward and away with a decisive thunk. Immediately, salt spray and wind hit my face as the relative quiet of the enclosed cockpit gave way to the sounds of the open ocean, waves lapping against the partially submerged aircraft, the more distinct sound of approaching helicopters, and the metallic groans of an airframe under stress. I disconnected my G-suit and communications lines with practiced movements, then pulled myself upward, using the cockpit sides for leverage. Pain shot through my left shoulder, an injury I hadn't registered during the impact, but which now announced itself with burning intensity. The water continued rising, now at mid-chest level, its cold embrace accelerating my sense of urgency. We have visual on the pilot. He's egressing the aircraft. I heard a voice call over what must have been the rescue team's communication channel. Looking up, I saw a Coast Guard helicopter hovering approximately 200 feet above and slightly offset from my position. A rescue swimmer was already preparing to deploy, perched at the helicopter's open door. I pulled myself completely free of the cockpit and moved carefully onto the aircraft's wing, which remained partially above water. From this vantage point, I could see how fortunate my landing had been. The sandbar had indeed prevented the aircraft from sinking completely, with only the nose section submerged. The shoreline was visible approximately 600 yards away, beyond my ability to reach by swimming in my current condition. The rescue swimmer hit the water approximately 30 yards from my position and quickly closed the distance with powerful strokes. Lieutenant Commander Matthews, Coast Guard Rescue, he called out as he approached. "Are you injured?" I took a moment to assess. The shoulder pain was significant but not debilitating, and I had full range of motion in my extremities despite the shock and impact forces. Left shoulder injury, possibly minor, otherwise intact. I responded, the military brevity returning despite the extraordinary circumstances. As Matthews reached me and began the rescue procedure, I glanced back at the aircraft, $70 million of advanced technology, now a salt-waterlogged wreck. But as the rescue collar was secured around my torso and the helicopter began hoisting us clear of the water, I found myself filled not with regret, but with an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. Against all odds, I brought the aircraft down without catastrophic failure, navigated an impossible glide path to the only viable landing zone within range, and survived what should have been unsurvivable. As we rose toward the waiting helicopter, I watched my fighter slip further into the water, not as a failure, but as testament to the extraordinary measures that sometimes separate life from death in the unforgiving world of military aviation.